Hello and welcome to Hydra Collectables, where we let our geek flag fly. My name's Luke and I'm your host, and today we're going to discuss a subject very close to my heart, which is time travel within fiction. I am a huge time travel fan. I absolutely adore the concepts of time travel. There have been so many movies throughout time that, pardon the pun, that explore the different methods and the different ways of time travel, whether that be through the acts of creating a machine, or whether it be through wormholes and portals, or whether it be through light speed or magic. And then you have things like in Doctor Who with the TARDIS, which is kind of a combination of multiple different methods. I don't really want to focus too much on the methods of time travel, but more the actual occurrence of time travel. And I think I've kind of broken it down into three separate sections. I think that every movie can kind of fit into one of these three sections. So I'd like to go through this short list and give you some examples of how this particular time travel works. So if time travel is your thing, stay tuned because, yeah, we're going to delve quite deep. So the first method of time travel, or the first type of time travel, is actually that of interstellar travel. This is basically traveling at the speed of light, where the people who are traveling at the high speed are aging at a different rate to those left on our normal planet Earth timeline. Now, this is probably the one act of time travel which is the most realistic to our to our understanding of how things work, the rules of the universe, laws of physics. So yeah, this is basically the premise of films like Interstellar or the original Planet of the Apes, which is when the astronauts will go up into space, travel at the speed of light, where they don't really age. It's the passing of a few months to a few years for them. Meanwhile, on our original timeline back on Earth, it could be anything from thousands to millions of years. And so by the time they make it back, things have changed. And so that is why we have the Planet of the Apes, or children that have aged, or even just meeting grandchildren in the future who always told the story of their astronaut predecessors that had gone up and might one day return. So this is the one that is probably most realistic, and probably the one that we'll hopefully one day encounter within our own time. I mean, already when they take clocks up to the space station, the time is different to that here on Earth. So we know that there is a shift, there is a difference based on where you are within the universe. So yeah, really interesting stuff. However, if we're going to discuss time travel in the more common sense, the one that most people think about, then I believe there are only two other types, and so I'm going to go over those with you now. So the first one is unchangeable time travel, and so we have examples being my classic favourite, Lost, which I won't focus too much on because I have a whole other video dedicated to that, and Harry Potter. John's Comics with Kids has been reading Harry Potter, and it's kind of got me into the thinking mindset of that series again, so I'm going to use that as an example. So yeah, this sort of time travel is basically what happened. It was always that way. So if you're going to go back into the past, it means that while you were originally living it, you were always there. It always occurred. That is the way that it's always been and how it will always be. And one of the important things here that you have to remember as well is, by going back into the past, that past is now your present, meaning that you can certainly die. It's not one of those scenarios where you're like, well, I know I'm going to be in the future, because it's not. It's your present. It's their past. So, a good example, as I say, is in Harry Potter, where Harry believes that he had previously been rescued by the spirit of his father, only to then realise that he was actually rescued by himself, because he had travelled back into the past, realised that no one was coming, and then it suddenly clicked and he realised that it was actually himself. And so, yeah, he had to always go back in order to save himself. And it does create that little time loop paradox thing. But when they actually they arrive back at the moment where they time traveled into the past, and so they're able to just continue along that path line as if anything didn't happen. It's just that one little loop is just trapped forever in an infinite way. Um, we'll discuss paradoxes soon. Next, you have your changeable timelines. These are timelines that create alternate universes, multiverse as it were. And so your typical classics of Back to the Future, Groundhog Day, Edge of Tomorrow, Christmas Carol, Bill and Ted, the list goes on and on. This is probably the time travel that we're most familiar with, the most recent being the actual MCU with Endgame, showing us and indicating how this sort of time travel occurs. So as you can see here, we would carry on along our timeline until the time where we would go back in time and a change would be made. Something would occur that would then cause it to split off into its own unique timeline. And this is seen in Back to the Future, where we know that even after Marty returns to the present, that his parents have changed. The logo of the town sign has changed. He is in a different reality. It is no longer the same place that he had left to go into the past. And then we got things like Groundhog Day or Edge of Tomorrow, which is also known as, I think, Live Die Repeat over in the US. And this is what I like to call the do-over. It's like a video game, a restart. And so, the day begins and he goes through the courses of events until it restarts and puts him straight back at the beginning, maintaining the knowledge that you have learnt throughout that time until eventually enough time has passed by that you get that right set of circumstances in order to break free and live your life on as usual. So this is probably the most common time travel that we see. This is also probably the more light-hearted, Hot Tub Time Machine, Back to the Future, etc. These are just good old fun popcorn movies where anything can happen because we have this multiverse theory. So with this changeable time travel, I want to just take a moment to mention a very particular and very awesome film called Primer, which came out in 2004. This film is very low budget. It won several awards at different festivals. But in my opinion, this is the best time travel movie I've ever seen. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but as you can see, it is rather complex. It involves, spending time within the box. So there is some form of logic to this where in order to go back 8 hours, you have to spend 8 hours within the machine. And again, like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail right here, but it leads to taking machines back inside machines with you and etc etc. So it's a very unique and very, very cool premise of a film. So if you're interested in Primer, or if you've seen Primer and didn't quite understand it, I'm going to leave a explanation video at the end of this one, so please stay tuned. So before we move on, one film that I think doesn't get the attention that it deserves is Tim Burton's remake and retelling of the classic Planet of the Apes, because this uses time travel on a totally different spectrum, and I really do think that it deserves more respect than it currently gets. This is a phenomenal film, let alone the fact of the unique storyline in, this is a remake, not a reboot. They were never on Earth, and so they had to mix it up a bit and give you different surprises. And so that's where this method of time travel really comes into play. And I think it's important that we, at least give it its due and establish that this is a very interesting concept. So we have two different timelines, and we're going to go with the Earth's timeline and the Apes planet timeline. And as you can see, in the beginning of the film, we have the little chimp in the space suit actually gets sucked into a wormhole. And then Mark Wahlberg decides that he's going to go get his chimp back, and he follows the chimp into the wormhole. And so we follow Mark Wahlberg's journey through the wormhole where he lands on the Planet of the Apes. So he carries on throughout his time until eventually he ends up in the Forbidden Zone. And there we see the wreckage of his original ship. So what we then learn is that the original ship then follows him into the wormhole, in order to get the crew member back. However, because of the way the wormhole works, the further into Earth's future timeline that we go, the further back in the Apes timeline they end up. So by the ship going in last, it actually turned up first, and so therefore is in the Forbidden Zone and actually led to the creation of this life form that we now have on this planet. So with that in mind, we have the ship that went into the wormhole last arriving first, Mark Wahlberg's character still just appearing as number 2, and then with the chimp eventually making his way, coming into the Apes present, and befriending Mark Wahlberg because it was his pet chimp, he was in charge of it, and basically showing the apes that the Messiah has come and that apes can live with people. So a very fitting story. Now, when Mark Wahlberg's character decides to go back through the wormhole in order to get back to his home, we have to assume that some point in this apes timeline, some point in the future, maybe hundreds of years for all we know, these apes harness the power of this found technology, in the Forbidden Zone, and through that they would be able to then venture back through the wormhole and end up in the Earth's timeline distant past, therefore changing our timeline, which is why when Mark Wahlberg's character comes into his Earth's timeline's present, that it has actually been taken over by the apes. And so I think a lot of people didn't realise how uniquely intelligent this ending was. I think it threw a lot of people and they didn't really understand. But everyone understood the original ending of Planet of the Apes with the planet being Earth all along, whereas this is completely different. This is 2 separate planets, which is indicated, I believe, by 2 sunsets on the Planet of the Apes, whereas obviously our universe only has the one sun. But yeah, such a unique ending and so cool, because it means that no matter how far ahead in this timeline the apes opted to go into space travel, that puts them so much further back in our history. And so yeah, when you see Thade in the place of Abraham Lincoln, it's a shocker in a good way. And I really think that if you didn't understand that that's where the film was going before, please watch it again, because this film does deserve a lot more than it's got. So yeah, that's time travel in 3 different ways. But let's talk paradoxes. You kind of can't help but encounter paradoxes when it comes to time travel. And probably the most common one, other than the grandfather paradox, which is if you go back and kill your grandfather, do you even exist? But like what we say, that creates a different timeline. Within the multiverse. The other paradox would be the Bootstrap Paradox. Now, this one is very well referenced within the show Lost, which I know not everyone likes that show, but there is actually a compass, and this compass is given to John Locke by Richard Alpert, who in turn gives it to Richard Alpert to prove that he is from the future in the past. So therefore the compass doesn't actually have an owner. It never existed within time. And the thing is, because of the way the show goes, Locke owns this compass for what might be a couple of months. He gives it to Richard, who then has it for 50 odd years. And so when the time finally comes back to him giving it to John Locke, that compass has aged 50 odd years at every given time, and being trapped in this infinite loop. Richard even makes a point of saying, it's a little bit rusty, but it can still find north. Well, what happens when this compass completely gives up the ghost? What happens when it rusts to the point of decay and turns to dust? And we have the character Eloise Hawking actually mentioned to Desmond in a completely separate episode that the universe has a way of course correcting. And so maybe something else, another item, will take the place of the compass as time goes on. We'll never know. For now, for the state of that story, it was the compass. Another version of the Bootstrap Paradox would also be, imagine that there's a knock at your door. And you open the door and there's no one there, but there's a parcel. And you don't know who the parcel came from or what's inside. You open it up and there is a book, and it's an instruction manual of how to build a time machine. So you get to work, and after 10 years of trial and error, you finally do it, and you've built your time machine. And all of a sudden it hits you. You realise, and you reach for the shelf, you grab the book, and you jump into that time machine to go back 10 years to leave it on your doorstep. Now, in this scenario, does the time traveller have free will? Or was it always destined to go this way? And what about the book? After all, this is paper. It's aged 10 years. As it keeps going round and round, it's going to keep aging those 10 years. Now, one of the theories behind this Bootstrap Paradox is, what if the very act of time travel itself de-ages the item? So that means that when the book goes back into time, it's actually de-aged by those 10 years. Now, that's fine, but the problem would also be that you too would de-age by 10 years. Now, that wouldn't be so much of a problem if you're in your 30s or 40s and you de-age, but it would certainly stop you from being able to go too far back in time. There's no point in going back in time if you could only go back as far as you've existed, which again kind of goes back to the whole primer thing with the you can only travel as far as that first box being turned on. So it's interesting. These paradoxes do tend to ground us, but then even in reality, even in physics today, we don't really understand or know everything, and who knows in the future what we might discover and unlock for these potential things. I myself do believe that only forward time travel is possible, the interstellar stuff that we discussed right at the beginning of the video. I don't think we're ever going to be able to actually go back in time. But who knows? No time travelers have turned up yet. Maybe there are certain rules that they have to adhere to. So yeah, it's just a waiting game for now. So yeah, everyone knows the classic time travel stories. We all know of, Terminator, Back to the Future, Avengers Endgame, etc. But I wanted to take the opportunity to recommend you guys 5 films that you might not have heard of. So without further ado, here they are. We'll start at the bottom. We have 12 Monkeys in 1995. We have Source Code, released in 2011. We have Time Lapse in 2014. Predestination in 2014, which is a film that I've just recently discovered, and I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. And then, of course, Primer, which I've already discussed, and if you stay tuned, there will be more about that at the end of this video. So, if you haven't seen any of these 5 films, these are my recommendations. And I'd like you yourselves to actually recommend to me in the comments below any movies that you think that I might not have watched with this time travel element. One of the beauties of time travel is that, whether you go back into the past or into the distant future, the changes can be drastically different or very subtle. And so I feel like it really does pave the way for some entertaining topics. Bring them forth and let me know what your favourites are, and I'll certainly check them out. So until next time, I'll see you in another life. Take care. Okay, so next I'm going to give some pretty major spoilers for the movie Primer. So if you haven't seen it and you're interested, please stop the video now. I won't be offended. Go and watch it, and then come back here and we can carry on. I do highly recommend this film. It is very low budget. It's very hard to watch, but if you dedicate the time, if you give it the time, it does pay off. Especially if you're a fan of this sort of genre of movie. So with that being said, let's move on to the spoilers. So this is how we first perceive the events of the movie. So we have Abe, who basically tests time travel, and he decides then that it has worked, and he's going to inform his friend. So this moment here signifies Abe showing Aaron that time travel exists. And the way he does this, the way he proves this, is they actually drive to the storage lockup, where they are able to look through binoculars at Abe about to go into the machine. So we know that, we can see that there's 2 of them. So obviously this thing quite clearly works. So then, with this big revelation, they decide that they're going to utilize this in order to play the stock market and basically make a shed load of cash. So the way they do it is they book into a hotel room for the day, so they have no interaction with anyone else. They watch the stock market, they make their notes, and then they go and get into these machines. And like I say, they have to stay within these machines for the amount of time that they wish to travel back. So say like 8 hours, 12 hours, etc. So during this time, they travel back and they relive that day playing the stock market and make a shed load of cash as anticipated. And as we know, when they come back is the time that we see them going into the past. So, they can just take on that place of their former selves and go home and enjoy the day, knowing that their former selves have just gone back in this time loop. It is quite confusing. They carry on the following day and do exactly the same. They put themselves in the hotel room and they play the stock market and again make a load of cash. At this point, however, let's go back and discuss this. So that first day of playing the stock market, that's the first time that they both time travel together. And they go back that evening to Aaron's house, where his wife just makes a throwaway comment of there being rats up in the loft. We can hear noises of things scurrying around. Then on Wednesday, like I say, they redo it again after the success. But on this day, Aaron actually ends up getting an ear bleed, which is quite odd. We start to see the potential dangers of time travel. And then we have Thursday, where they decide to do the same thing again. Now, as the day goes on and they're locked in the hotel, Aaron receives a phone call from his wife. Now, they think nothing of it, and they just think, oh, okay, it'll be fine. Just don't bring your phone next time, and this won't interfere. However, he still does bring his phone. And so the second him takes the phone call, which means the first him never did. And they begin to panic because that starts unlocking a whole number of things where they realise that the past can be changed and can be altered, and they've got to be super careful. Now, Abe, fearing the worst, has actually already set up a fail-safe that he can go back and completely reset. And his intentions are that if something goes wrong, he could always go back in time and basically sabotage the machine before he first discovers that it works. So that's his fail-safe plan. And during this moment with the phone call and a few other things that happen in the story that I won't get into, the panic ensues and he goes back to launch his fail-safe. And the way he does that is by locking up his former self, drugging him and putting him into a cupboard in the house, and then living that life as he would normally, sabotaging the machine, etc. This is how we believe the events to take place. However, it does go a little differently. So yeah, what has actually happened is a totally different setup entirely, where we actually have Aaron, after being told about time travel and after experiencing the first thing, he goes back to the storage unit where he discovers that Abe has actually taken out a rental on a secondary lockup. And so he decides to break into that lockup and take a look, where he realizes that Abe has put his failsafe. And fearing that this could all be taken away from him, what he actually does is he packs up the machine that they had made that day, the second machine, and he takes it with himself in that failsafe machine to go back and plant his own failsafe machine. So bear with me. So when he then goes back and does that, he then obviously lives his life knowing full well what has occurred and what has happened, meaning that when Abe first tells him about time travel, he's acting surprised. He already knows. He's already lived it once, and he's actually listening to some headphones at this time, which we now know to be audio recordings that he made for himself so that he could follow what he had done from memory as close to the mark as possible. So this also leads us to understand why Aaron is actually getting the ear bleeds, because he has actually gone back more times than Abe, and so is experiencing these effects sooner. And so basically the story carries on until the point of the phone call, knowing that Abe is going to go back and reset everything, Aaron also goes back in order to reset. So this first time where he goes back, when he takes the machine back with him, he has to deal with his former self. And so what he does is he actually drugs the milk for the breakfast cereal and then locks him away in the loft, which is why we can hear the rats up in the loft in the previous timeline. That is actually a drugged up or comatose version of himself just being locked away for safekeeping. When he goes back the second time, he actually fights with himself. However, he fights back, and they finally come to a conclusion that he should just leave. And so the older version of him is convinced just to go away and is never seen again. And so, yeah, that's basically how this very confusing but kind of understandable story takes place. Like I say, I highly recommend that you check this out. So I'm just going to erase this and give you a quick breakdown. So yeah, here we have the standard breakdown of both timelines for both characters. And as you can see, it leaves us with 2 copies of Abe, while we have 3 copies of Aaron. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting state of affairs, isn't it? I absolutely loved this film. I love that they didn't dub down the science. I love that they allowed the audience members to, discover along the way. And this particular film really does benefit from a second watch. This played on my mind for so long after watching it the first time, and I'm really, it's just a really good film. I really think that this is very intelligent, very clever, and I would love to see it be remade with a higher budget, because I think that's where it was lacking. I think there's a few moments where you don't quite realise what's going on, things having to be filmed in shadow or filmed not particularly well, and you can't really identify whether or not there are more than one of the same people at any given time. But it's all just down to budget. I mean, this was written and created and directed, all by the same guy. So yeah, credit where credit is due. This film is awesome. So yeah, that's my explanation tag on for Primer. So I really hope you guys enjoyed it. One of the other little throwaway moments within Primer is actually that one of the side effects of time travel, despite the bleeding from the ears, etc., is also that their handwriting always looks very scribbly and weird after their first time travel incident. Now, there's a throwaway moment at the beginning of the film where they first discovered the machine, and they drop some particles into this little void, this section of air above the machine, and it all kind of freezes in time, so indicating the being able to freeze time travel. And my thoughts are that their hands actually enter that area, and so their hands are dislodged from time. They're working on a different time zone to the rest of their body, which is why their handwriting isn't recognizable to themselves moving forward. So yeah, it's those little subtleties that they don't throw it in your face, but it's there if you look, and that's another reason why I really like this film. So yeah, thank you guys for taking time to watch. This is a much longer video than what I'm used to, so yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it, and until next time, I'll see you in another life. Take care.